The morning of June 6, 1944, off the coast of Normandy, Generalmajor Wilhelm Richter stood in his headquarters bunker overlooking Sword Beach and watched something that contradicted every intelligence briefing he had received for the past 18 months. Through the grey dawn haze and the smoke of naval bombardment, landing craft appeared on the horizon in numbers that seemed to violate the physical laws of industrial production. Not dozens of vessels, not hundreds, but thousands of armada so vast that it stretched beyond the limits of vision in both directions. Along the Norman coast, Richter commanded the 716th Infantry Division defending this sector of the Atlantic Wall, studied Allied capabilities with the methodical attention that characterized German military planning. He knew the estimated number of landing craft available to Allied forces, understood their construction schedules, and had been assured by Wehrmacht intelligence that the WWIIs could not possibly assemble the shipping necessary for a cross-channel invasion of the scale required to succeed against prepared defenses. The intelligence staff at OKW maintained detailed assessments showing Allied landing craft production, merchant vessel availability, and the logistical constraints that would limit any amphibious operation to manageable proportions. And yet, here off Normandy, landing craft delivered wave after wave of Allied infantry, armor, and supplies from ships that appeared to have materialized from an industrial capacity beyond German comprehension. The engagement itself would pass into history as D-Day, the largest amphibious operation ever conducted, a triumph of planning and courage that opened the Second Front in Europe. But for Richter and the officers around him, something else was happening beyond the immediate tactical crisis. They were confronting evidence of an industrial system so vast, so efficient, that it challenged every assumption upon which German strategic planning had been based since 1939. The question that would haunt German commanders through the final 11 months of war in Europe was forming in that moment, off Normandy, though few would speak it aloud. How many landing craft did the Allies possess? More critically, how fast could they build them? The answers, when German intelligence finally compiled them fully, would reveal not just a gap in industrial capacity, but a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of modern warfare itself. This is the story of how German officers in the most rigorous military academies in Europe, veterans of campaigns from Poland to Russia, came to understand that they had entered a war against opponents whose industrial capacity exceeded their most pessimistic estimates by orders of magnitude. It is the story of the Higgins boat and the LS vessels that appeared in Allied service with such relentless regularity that German intelligence officers initially refused to believe their own reconnaissance reports. And it is the story of the psychological reckoning that occurs when professional military men realize that tactical brilliance and defensive preparation cannot overcome an opponent who can simply build faster than you can destroy. The central irony was this: German military planners had predicted Allied industrial strength would be formidable. They had based their entire defensive strategy on the assumption that Germany's interior lines, efficient industry, and disciplined workforce could match Allied production despite having fewer resources. They had been confident in their calculations. They had simply failed to imagine how catastrophically wrong those calculations were. When German commanders finally comprehended the true scale of Allied landing craft production, when they understood that specialized amphibious vessels were appearing in English ports at intervals measured in days rather than months, the realization carried implications that extended far beyond defensive tactics. It meant that every strategic assumption that had guided German planning since 1941 had been based on estimates that were not merely incorrect, but fundamentally, fatally optimistic. To understand the shock that German commanders experienced when confronting Allied amphibious capability, one must first understand the supreme confidence with which Germany approached coastal defense in 1940 to 1943. This confidence was not arrogance or nationalist delusion. It was built on genuine military achievement, careful study of amphibious operations throughout history, and rational analysis of observable facts as they existed in early war years. The German military in 1943 represented the culmination of decades of professional development. Following the Treaty of Versailles restrictions, Germany had rebuilt its armed forces with particular emphasis on quality, training, and doctrinal innovation. The Wehrmacht, that conquered Poland, France, and swept across the Soviet Union had demonstrated tactical excellence, That made it arguably the most effective fighting force in the world. By 1941-1942, German defensive doctrine had been refined through extensive study and practical experience. The Atlantic Wall, stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, represented application of lessons learned from centuries of coastal warfare combined with modern engineering and firepower. The fortifications incorporated overlapping fields of fire, reinforced concrete bunkers resistant to naval bombardment, extensive minefields, beach obstacles, and carefully prepared killing zones, where attacking forces would be caught in predetermined fire sectors. German analysis of amphibious operations throughout history had identified consistent patterns. Attacking forces faced inherent disadvantages. They arrived tired, disorganized, and vulnerable after sea transit. They lacked heavy weapons during initial assault waves. They required time to establish supply lines ashore, and they operated under time pressure to secure beachheads before defenders could bring up reserves. German planners had studied the failed Gallipoli campaign of 1915, where Turkish defenders had contained Allied landings through well-prepared positions and aggressive counterattacks. They had analyzed the Dieppe raid of August 1942, where German defenders had inflicted catastrophic casualties on Canadian and British forces, demonstrating that direct assault on fortified ports was virtually suicidal. These historical examples validated German confidence that prepared defenses could defeat amphibious attacks even against numerically superior opponents. The Wehrmacht's defensive success on the Eastern Front provided additional confidence. German forces fighting in Russia had demonstrated repeatedly that well-positioned defenders using modern weapons could inflict disproportionate casualties on attacking forces, even when outnumbered. If German defenders could stop Soviet armored divisions in open terrain, surely they could defeat Allied forces struggling ashore from landing craft under observed fire. The strategic calculation that shaped German coastal defense assumed that Allied amphibious capability was constrained by finite resources. Intelligence estimates suggested the Allies possessed perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 landing craft of all types suitable for cross-channel operations. This number, while substantial, seemed manageable from a defensive perspective. The Norman coast offered limited suitable landing sites. German forces could concentrate defenses at likely invasion points. Even if Allies achieved initial lodgment, the rate at which they could build up forces ashore would be limited by available shipping. German reserves could be brought forward faster than Allied reinforcements could land, creating conditions for counterattack that would drive invasion forces back into the sea. What German planners failed to anticipate was not merely the scale of Allied landing craft production, but the speed and systematization with which American industry had revolutionized amphibious vessel construction. The industrial achievement that enabled D-Day and subsequent Allied amphibious operations represented application of American mass production principles to a military problem that European powers had approached through traditional shipbuilding methods. The story of Allied landing craft production begins with Andrew Jackson Higgins, a New Orleans boat builder who had spent the 1930s designing shallow draft vessels for use in Louisiana swamps and marshes. Higgins boats, as they were known locally, featured a unique bow ramp that allowed the vessel to approach shallow water, discharge passengers or cargo directly onto shore, retract, and withdraw. This simple innovation solved a problem that had plagued amphibious operations throughout military history: how to get troops from ship to shore quickly, without requiring them to wade through deep water under fire or climb down rope nets into smaller boats. The U.S. Marine Corps, studying amphibious doctrine in the late 1930s, recognized the potential of Higgins's design for military applications. After testing and modifications, the Navy adopted what became the LCV-P landing craft vehicle. Personnel officially, in 1941, the basic design was elegant in its simplicity: a 36-foot plywood hull, powered by a diesel engine, capable of carrying 36 troops, or a small vehicle, with a bow ramp that dropped to allow rapid exit onto beaches. The genius of the Higgins boat lay not in technological sophistication, but in its suitability for mass production. The vessels used simple marine plywood construction techniques that required minimal specialized shipbuilding knowledge. The engines were standard diesel motors already in mass production for commercial use. The mechanical components, ramps, pumps, steering gear used off-the-shelf parts available from multiple suppliers. Most critically, the boats could be built by workers with basic carpentry skills in facilities that were not traditional shipyards. Andrew Higgins's company in New Orleans transformed from a small operation building specialized boats into an industrial complex employing over 20,000 workers at peak production. But Higgins Industries was only one part of a distributed production system that included dozens of subcontractors across the United States. Boat sections were prefabricated in inland facilities, shipped to assembly points, and put together in production lines that borrowed directly from automobile manufacturing methods. At peak production, in 1943-1944, American industry was completing Higgins boats at rates exceeding 700 per month. The scale of this production becomes comprehensible only through specific numbers. Between 1942 and 1945, American manufacturers produced over 23,000 LCVPs. This represented more amphibious assault craft than all other nations combined had produced in all of previous military history. But the LCVP was merely one component of Allied amphibious capability. The LST landing ship tank represented an even more remarkable industrial achievement. These vessels, over 300 feet long and displacing 4,000 tons fully loaded, could carry 20 Sherman tanks or equivalent cargo directly to shore, drive their bow onto the beach, open massive bow doors, and discharge vehicles directly onto land. The ships were essentially floating bridges that connected deepwater anchorages to hostile shores, eliminating the need to capture ports before landing heavy equipment. LST design emerged from British requirements, articulated in 1941 after studying the challenges of amphibious operations. The British designed the basic concept, but American industry transformed it into reality through mass production techniques that European shipyards could not match. LSTs required large covered building facilities, heavy lifting equipment, and complex machinery installations. Traditional shipbuilding doctrines suggested such vessels would require specialized construction at established naval shipyards over timelines measured in months per ship. American industry approached LST construction with methods that violated every established shipbuilding tradition. Rather than building ships sequentially at traditional shipyards, American planners distributed LST construction across facilities that had never built seagoing vessels. The vessels were designed with flat bottoms and simple machinery arrangements that facilitated rapid construction. Hull sections were prefabricated in inland factories, transported to assembly sites by rail, and welded together using standardized procedures that could be taught to workers with minimal prior shipbuilding experience. The program achieved production rates that seemed impossible by European standards. Between 1942 and 1945, American shipyards completed over 1,000 LSTs at peak production. LSTs were being launched at rates exceeding one per day from multiple building sites across the country. Each LST represented approximately 600 tons of steel, complex diesel-electric machinery, and sophisticated design that allowed the vessel to carry 2,000 tons of cargo, while drawing only 3 feet of water forward, enabling beach landings on gradually sloping shores. Beyond LCVPs and LST, the Allied amphibious fleet included dozens of other specialized vessel types, each designed for specific purposes and each produced in quantities that German intelligence found difficult to credit. LC is landing craft. Infantry could transport 200 troops directly to shore. LC mislanding craft. Mechanized carried individual tanks or artillery pieces. LCTS landing craft. Tanks were smaller than LSTs, but could still beach themselves and discharge armor. Specialized variants included rocket ships for bombardment, command ships with advanced communications, repair ships, hospital ships, and countless support vessels that created a complete amphibious capability independent of port facilities. German intelligence officers, tracking Allied shipping in British ports during 1943 and early 1944, compiled reports documenting an assembly of amphibious capability that their superiors found incredible. Reconnaissance photographs showed harbors filled with landing craft in numbers that exceeded pre-war estimates of total Allied capacity. Intelligence summaries noted that new vessels appeared constantly, with no apparent limit to production. Reports transmitted to OKW documented the situation with professional precision, but the analysis faced institutional skepticism. The idea that Allies could produce specialized amphibious vessels at rates comparable to mass-produced cargo ships, seemed to violate basic assumptions about maritime construction complexity. Landing craft required specialized design features, complex bow ramp mechanisms, and careful engineering to balance cargo capacity against shallow draft requirements. Surely such vessels could not be manufactured like automobiles on assembly lines. The first major Allied amphibious operation using the new production vessels occurred in Sicily in July 1943. Operation Husky involved over 2,500 vessels landing 160,000 troops on Sicily's southern coast in a single night. German and Italian defenders on Sicily watched the armada approach with growing disbelief. The number of landing craft exceeded intelligence estimates by factors that suggested either gross miscounting or fundamental errors in understanding Allied industrial capacity. The Sicily operation revealed not just numerical superiority, but systematic integration of amphibious capability. Landing craft delivered infantry in coordinated waves. LSTs landed tanks within hours of initial assault. Specialized vessels provided fire support, medical facilities, and command and control. The attacking forces established supply lines ashore that operated independently of ports, delivering ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements at rates that matched or exceeded consumption. German forces defending Sicily found themselves fighting an enemy that could sustain operations through improvised logistics that traditional military thinking suggested should be impossible. Following Sicily, the Salerno landings in September 1943 demonstrated similar Allied capability on an even larger scale. Then came Anzio in January 1944, where Allied forces landed an entire corps behind German lines, establishing a beachhead supplied entirely through landing craft without requiring port facilities. Each operation demonstrated the same pattern: overwhelming numbers of specialized vessels delivered forces ashore at rates German defenders could not contain, sustained operations through ship-to-shore logistics, and built combat power faster than defenders could bring up reserves. German commanders, analyzing these operations, compiled assessments that documented a capability that seemed to defy reasonable limits. After-action reports noted landing craft appearing in numbers that exceeded previous operation counts, suggesting continuous production and deployment. Intelligence officers calculated that to sustain operations observed in Italy, the Allies would need to possess landing craft inventories, several times larger than pre-war German estimates suggested existed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to command Army Group B, defending France in late 1943, REVIEWED, intelligence on Allied amphibious capability with particular attention. Rommel had faced Allied forces in North Africa, had witnessed the material superiority Allied forces brought to every engagement, and approached coastal defense with fewer illusions than many Wehrmacht officers regarding German prospects. His assessment, documented in reports to OKW in early 1944, explicitly acknowledged that Allied landing craft production had created capability that rendered traditional coastal defense doctrine problematic. Proposed solution: defeat the invasion on the beaches during the first 24 hours reflected understanding that once Allied forces established beachheads supplied through their enormous landing craft fleet, driving them back into the sea would be impossible. His disagreement with other German commanders was not about Allied capability but about how to respond to it. The disagreement was never resolved before D-Day arrived. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the full scale of Allied amphibious capability manifested off Normandy in a display that exceeded even the most pessimistic German estimates. Over 5,000 vessels participated in the initial assault, including more than 4,000 landing craft and specialized amphibious vessels. The Armada transported 156,000 troops ashore on the first day, along with thousands of vehicles, tons of supplies, and complete logistics infrastructure that operated independently of ports. German defenders at coastal positions reported to headquarters throughout the morning, their messages documenting shock at the scale of attack. Radio intercepts captured by Allied intelligence noted German commanders reporting landing craft in numbers that seemed impossible, continuing waves of troops and vehicles being landed without pause, and supply operations that functioned despite lacking port facilities. General Major Richter, defending Sword Beach, watched throughout D-Day as landing craft delivered wave after wave of British infantry and armor. His defensive positions inflicted casualties, destroyed individual vessels, and contested every yard of beach. But the attacks never stopped. Each destroyed landing craft was replaced by another. Each wave of infantry that suffered casualties was followed by another wave. The rate of Allied buildup exceeded the rate at which German forces could inflict attrition. By evening of June 6th, Allied forces had established beachheads at 5 locations along the Norman coast. German counterattacks planned to drive invasion forces back into the sea found that Allied forces ashore had already built combat power sufficient to repel German armor. The window for defeating the invasion on the beaches, as Rommel had advocated, had closed within the first day because Allied landing craft had delivered forces at rates that exceeded German the ability to contain them. The subsequent weeks of the Normandy campaign revealed the true strategic significance of Allied landing craft production. Without capturing ports, Cherbourg did not fall until June 26. 3 weeks after the Allied forces sustained operations entirely through ship-to-shore logistics using their massive landing craft fleet. 2 artificial harbors, the Mulberries, were constructed off the invasion beaches. But even when a storm destroyed one Mulberry in mid-June, the landing craft fleet maintained sufficient delivery rates to sustain 7th Allied divisions in continuous combat operations. German intelligence officers analyzing Allied logistics during the Normandy campaign compiled assessments that forced recognition of realities that had been dismissed as impossible only months earlier. The Allies were sustaining offensive operations at the end of supply lines that stretched across the English Channel without benefit of major port facilities. Daily supply tonnage delivered through landing craft exceeded rates that established ports normally handled. This logistical achievement rested entirely on the enormous landing craft production that American industry had accomplished over the previous 2 years. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, submitted reports to OKW in July 1944 that explicitly acknowledged Allied material superiority made German defensive success mathematically impossible. His assessment noted that Allied landing craft production had created operational flexibility that allowed them to land forces anywhere along thousands of miles of coastline, that German forces could not possibly defend every potential invasion site, and that Allied logistical capability eliminated traditional advantages that defenders enjoyed when attackers operated far from their bases. The psychological impact on German coastal defenders extended beyond specific battles to fundamental understanding of strategic realities. Soldiers who had been assured that Atlantic Wall fortifications made Allied invasion impossible watched as overwhelming Allied forces simply absorbed defensive fire and continued landing in numbers that made individual German success irrelevant to overall outcomes. Artillery that destroyed landing craft found more craft appearing immediately. Machine gun positions that inflicted casualties on one wave of attackers faced another wave minutes later. The defensive preparations that German forces had worked on for years were overcome through sheer material superiority that tactical skill could not counter. German industrial capacity, stretched across multiple fronts by 1944, could not respond with comparable production even had German planners recognized the need earlier. German shipyards were building U-boats, destroyers, and small coastal vessels for defensive operations. The industrial resources, labor, and materials required to build thousands of landing craft simply did not exist within Germany's constrained economy. Steel production was declining due to Allied bombing and raw material shortages. Skilled shipyard workers were increasingly scarce as military conscription drew men into combat units. The facilities that might have built landing craft were committed to programs that offered more immediate tactical value for Germany's defensive situation. Moreover, German strategic circumstances in 1944 made amphibious capability irrelevant to Wehrmacht needs. Germany was defending interior lines, fighting on land across Europe and Russia. Landing craft would provide no benefit to German operations even if they could be produced. The asymmetry of strategic situations meant that Allied industrial focus on amphibious capability addressed Allied offensive requirements, while German industry focused on defensive weapons, anti-aircraft guns, artillery that addressed German strategic needs. This strategic asymmetry meant that even had German intelligence perfectly estimated Allied landing craft production in 1942, German responses would necessarily have been different from Allied programs. Germany could not match Allied amphibious vessel production because Germany did not need amphibious capability for its strategic circumstances. What Germany needed was ability to defend against that capability, which proved impossible through conventional means once Allied material superiority reached the levels achieved by 1944, the landing craft production. That enabled D-Day represented more than numerical superiority in one category of military equipment. It demonstrated systematic application of American industrial methods to military problems in ways that European military traditions had not anticipated. American industry approached landing craft construction as an engineering challenge, amenable to mass production solutions rather than as specialized shipbuilding requiring traditional maritime craftsmanship. The vessels themselves reflected American design philosophy that prioritized functionality and producibility over elegance or durability. Higgins boats were plywood craft with simple diesel engines that required relatively little maintenance but were not expected to last years. They were essentially disposable tools designed to accomplish specific missions rather than long-term capital investments. This approach allowed production at rates impossible for vessels built to traditional shipbuilding standards expecting decades of service life. The distributed production system that built landing craft drew on American industrial infrastructure developed for civilian manufacturing. Factories that had produced commercial boats, railroad cars, or even furniture adapted their facilities to landing craft production with minimal retooling. The standardization of components meant that engines from one manufacturer, hulls from another, and fittings from a third could be assembled into complete vessels, without requiring custom fitting or specialized expertise. Labor for landing craft production came from workforces that included women, elderly workers, and others not traditionally employed in shipbuilding. The simplified construction techniques made training relatively rapid. Workers learned specific tasks, welding particular seams, installing standard components, applying protective coatings that did not require comprehensive shipbuilding knowledge. This approach violated European craft traditions that emphasized skilled workers with years of apprenticeship, but it created production capacity that exceeded what traditional methods could achieve. The organizational achievement behind landing craft production matched the industrial accomplishment. Military planners, civilian industry leaders, and government procurement agencies coordinated programs involving thousands of contractors and subcontractors across the United States. Raw materials were allocated, transportation prioritized, and production schedules synchronized to ensure components arrived at assembly points when needed. The system functioned with efficiency that surprised even American participants, delivering vessels at rates that continuously exceeded planned targets. By war's end in 1945, American industry had produced over 40,000 landing craft of all types. This represented more amphibious assault capability than all other nations combined had possessed throughout all previous history. The production achievement rested on industrial infrastructure, organizational capability, and systematic approach to manufacturing that European powers could not replicate with their available resources and established traditions. German recognition of Allied landing craft superiority came too late and too incompletely to influence strategic decisions in ways that might have altered Germany's defensive approach. The evidence of Allied production capability that became undeniable on DID had been available in partial form much earlier, but institutional resistance to accepting unwelcome intelligence had delayed full recognition until strategic situations were IRRETRIEVABLE. German pre-war intelligence regarding Allied industrial capacity had been surprisingly detailed but inadequately interpreted. German observers had studied American manufacturing, documented production statistics, and filed reports describing American industrial methods, but these observations were filtered through assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. German planners assumed that American civilian industry would require years to convert to military production, that quality would suffer when traditional craftsmanship was replaced by mass production methods, and that American workers lacked the discipline and skill of European labor. Each assumption proved false. but institutional structures within German military planning made systematic reassessment difficult. Intelligence officers who reported evidence contradicting strategic assumptions faced professional consequences. Reports suggesting Allied capability exceeded expectations were sometimes dismissed as enemy propaganda or defaced thinking. The culture of Wehrmacht planning emphasized confidence in German tactical superiority and belief that military skill could overcome material disadvantages, characteristics that served poorly when realistic assessment required acknowledging strategic failure. By the time German leadership fully accepted that Allied landing craft production had made cross-channel invasion inevitable and sustainable, Germany had already committed to defensive strategies that assumed material parity could be achieved through tactical excellence. The decision to build the Atlantic Wall, to position reserves inland rather than near coasts, and to prioritize anti-invasion preparations over strategic depth defenses all reflected planning that had not adjusted to industrial realities. The appearance of thousands of landing craft off Normandy on June 6, 1944, represented more than numerical superiority in one equipment category. It represented fundamental difference in how the combatants approached industrial warfare. Allied strategy assumed that production capacity was decisive in modern war, that properly organized industry could deliver equipment in quantities that made tactical defeats irrelevant to strategic outcomes. German strategy, evolved from military traditions emphasizing quality and skill, had not fully incorporated industrial capacity as the primary determinant of victory in mechanized warfare. Allied operations following D-Day demonstrated sustainability that landing craft production enabled. The invasion of southern France in August 1944 used many of the same landing craft that had supported Normandy, demonstrating fleet flexibility. Operations in the Pacific used similar vessels to conduct island-hopping campaigns that Japanese forces found impossible to defend against. Each amphibious operation demonstrated that Allied landing craft capability had made contested shorelines indefensible through conventional means. German forces defending France after D-Day increasingly fought not to achieve victory, but to delay inevitable defeat. The landing craft that delivered Allied forces ashore in June continued delivering reinforcements and supplies at rates that exceeded German ability to interdict. German commanders watching Allied logistics operations recognized that the war had become a contest between Allied production and German defensive capability, a contest Germany could not win. The human cost of this industrial disparity manifested in German casualty rates that reflected hopelessness of strategic position. German forces defending Normandy died at rates exceeding 70% in many units. Replacements arrived with increasingly inadequate training and equipment as Germany's resource base contracted under Allied pressure. German soldiers fought courageously but faced opponents whose material advantages made individual German tactical success meaningless to overall outcomes. The story of German commanders witnessing Allied landing craft appearing in impossible numbers reveals fundamental truths about industrial warfare that transcend specific circumstances of World War II. The conflict between Germany and the Allies was decided not primarily by tactical skill, though tactics mattered in specific engagements. It was decided by industrial capacity, by ability to produce equipment, train personnel, and sustain operations across vast distances over extended time. German officers had entered the war as professionals, trained in Europe's finest military academies, veterans of successful campaigns, heirs to military traditions that emphasized excellence and discipline. They had studied Allied capabilities, had based their planning on careful analysis, and had developed strategies they believed realistic. Their failure was not incompetence or poor intelligence gathering. Their failure was inadequate imagination regarding what systematic industrial mobilization could achieve when nations fully committed to production. Warfare. The landing craft program represented American industrial philosophy applied to military challenge. The vessels were not individually superior to anything Germany might have built. German engineering could certainly have designed comparable craft, but Germany could not have built them in equivalent numbers because German industry remained organized along traditional lines, emphasizing quality production in established facilities using skilled craftsmen. American industry had transcended these limitations through systematic application of mass production principles that made quantity its own form of quality. By the time German commanders fully comprehended that Allied landing craft capability had made coastal defense strategically futile. The war's outcome was already determined. The vessels delivering troops ashore at Normandy would continue operating until Germany surrendered in May 1945. German forces would fight skillfully and courageously throughout those final months, but they fought against opponents whose industrial foundation made defeat inevitable regardless of German tactical success. The morning of June 6, 1944, when Generalmajor Richter saw landing craft that should not have existed in such numbers, marked not the beginning of German recognition of Allied industrial superiority, but merely one more confirmation of realities German intelligence had been documenting and German commanders had been struggling to accept. The landing craft were there, more would come, and nothing Germany could do would stop them. That knowledge, carried by professional officers trained to achieve victory through skill and preparation, represented perhaps the most complete strategic defeat. Military professionals can experience the recognition that their expertise, their courage, and their sacrifice could not alter outcomes determined by industrial forces beyond military control.